Do you know what the meaning of life is from the perspective of evolutionary theory? The answer is quite simple and absolutely scientific.
From a scientific point of view, the meaning of life is the propagation of DNA.
But if we look more closely, Dawkins' answer is not so clear-cut. Some species engage in behavior that appears self-defeating, yet this very behavior helps them spread their DNA effectively. And perhaps evolution has a higher purpose, one that remains unclear to us, but definitely not entirely random. In this video we will discuss three peculiarities of evolutionary theory: the Pea Paradox, group selection and convergent evolution. And you will see that discovering the meaning of biological life as a whole proves to be as elusive as the meaning of individual human existence. Look, this is the eye of almost any cephalopod, a squid, cuttlefish or octopus for example. And this is what the eye of almost any vertebrate looks like, such as a human. In fact, they are incredibly similar. Both eyes are on the camera type and have an eyelid, cornea, pupil, retina and lens. Well, you can see for yourself. These nearly identical eyes evolved in species that have nothing in common. Just think how different we are from squids and how different our environments are. This is called convergent evolution. The example of eyes is a classic one, but by no means the only one.
An even better example of convergent evolution is the so-called marsupial wolf. Now, if you saw that going along on a lead down the street, you would think it was a dog. But this is not a dog. It has nothing whatever to do with dogs. This is a marsupial. It's much more closely related to kangaroos and wombats and koalas.
On this site, more than 1,500 examples of convergent evolution are collected. I was quite impressed by the mechanism through which different species evolved to produce silk thread. This includes spiders, moths, bees and even ants. In total, 23 different types of animal produce silk thread. And this is despite the fact that creating thread is an incredibly complex process, regulated down to the second. Do you see what it looks like? It seems that evolution has an overwhelming need for silk. Random mutations led to a non-random goal. And let me emphasize this again. More than 1,500 examples of convergent evolution have been documented. Convergent evolution is the rule, not the exception. This suggests that possibly, if we were to rewind the evolutionary process back to the Big Bang and start it over, despite random mutations, we would end up with eyes, silk and many other things once more. Perhaps not with us humans, but certainly with some other species. Evolution would probably reach the same point by a different path because it inherently had a goal. Probably. I am not advocating the idea of a grand design here. It is just that modern data can also be interpreted in this way. And this is a completely scientific point of view. For example, here is another notable study where the authors claim that out of the almost infinite number of skeletal forms that are theoretically possible, we have only a few. The authors explain this quite simply. Evolution could not avoid these forms. Look, this is a typical beehive. It contains one queen bee, several hundred drones and about 60,000 ordinary worker bees, which are infertile. And now an uncomfortable question. If the meaning of life is the propagation of DNA,
From a scientific point of view, then
why has evolution led bees to develop tens of thousands of sterile individuals? And why does the same issue exist in other insects with a caste system, such as ants, wasps and termites? Initially, even Darwin was stunned by this fact. However, after some thought, he wrote in his magnum opus that in social animals, natural selection will adapt each individual to the needs of the entire community. Over time, this concept became known as kin selection. This is when an individual sacrifices their own life in the interest of others with whom it shares DNA, in the interest of its children, sisters, parents, cousins, and so on. We're usually taught in school that natural selection acts on an individual level. For instance, zebras that run faster than others tend to survive more often, and thus they are more likely to produce offspring with the inherited trait of speed. They help themselves and that trait remains in the genetics of their descendants. However, bees challenge this perspective, so we still don't have a clear answer as to what level evolution really works on. What does it ultimately aim for? So that each of us can adapt as much as possible to environmental conditions, or so that related groups can adapt as much as possible even at the expense of personal interests? This question can be explored further because in recent years, biologists have been actively discussing group selection again. It is quite similar to kin selection, but here individual sacrifices himself for the interest of a group of complete strangers. To keep it simple, here is the clearest version of the idea. At this point, it is appropriate to combine the two questions we have already discussed. If evolution had a goal, for whom was this goal set? For each of us individually, for small related groups, or for entire species? Maybe the meaning of life isn't about you as an individual, but about your family, your kin, or even the whole city you live in. Okay, let's assume again that all living things exist to spread their DNA, and any actions of living beings are just tools to achieve this goal. Dancing? Nope. You are luring a mate to spread your DNA. Fixing a truck? Nope. Actually, you are restoring your economic assets to attract a female and spread DNA. Everything in life boils down to one thing: fraud claps his hands. And the same thing happens with plants. Just to reproduce, they use other strategies. Flowers attract bees and hummingbirds with bright colors so that they pollinate other flowers and spread their DNA. Ferns rely on the wind to scatter their mature spores around the area. And strawberries and blueberries try to grow bigger and sweeter so that people domesticate them and start cultivating them. So, do you know what strategy peas have? It just plans to die. The thing is, peas usually ripen in a pot, and when the seeds are ready, a special detonator gene opens the pot so that the peas spill out and the genetic material is spread. From time to time, mutant individuals appears, whose detonator gene doesn't work. Therefore, the seeds just rot inside the pot hanging on the stem and no DNA propagation occurs. Now for a minute, imagine yourself as a hunter-gatherer. You stumble upon a pea field and see empty pea pods all around you. All the seeds, and peas are indeed seeds, are scattered on the ground. Some were eaten by birds, some rotted, some began to sprout, and all that's left for you are mutant pods. Jared Diamond in the book Guns, Germs and Steel writes, "The only pods available to humans to harvest would be the non-popping ones left on the plant. Thus, once humans began bringing wild peas home to eat, there was immediate selection for that single gene mutant." Do you understand? From the pea's perspective, striving for demise equals maximum survivability. It propagates its DNA best at the very moment it absolutely doesn't want to. Thus, the meaning of life for a pea is to die. You have probably heard the story about planes during World War II, which illustrates the survivorship bias. But if not, think about the fact that people who tell stories about being saved from drowning by dolphins only tell them because the dolphins push them towards the shore. You can't draw conclusions about a phenomenon based on the unsuccessful cases. After all, sometimes dolphins push people away from the shore and, as a result, there is no one left to tell the story. So when we talk about the meaning of life from the perspective of evolutionary theory, we fall into the same trap. We don't have definitive data on which species or forms of life fell by the wayside before we had the chance to study them. Very roughly speaking, if 10,000 years ago there was a pea that spoke Latin and its purpose in life was to dictate to us a collection of Harry Potter books, but it didn't want to spread its DNA, we just wouldn't know about it, because it didn't survive. Imagine, everything alive that surrounds us right now once survived. But that doesn't mean that everything that didn't survive was meaningless. Or in other words, the meaning of life for all living things is to propagate DNA, but only if you don't consider those who found meaning in something else.